So, good evening, everyone. I'm happy. First of all, I would like to wish you a happy new year. And I see we are starting the year quite dynamically with a new online seminar, and we have already 150 people, and there are more coming. And we're starting these online seminars of the Creative Classroom Group with a really interesting topic and with a really interesting speaker that I heard during the conference we had in the European School at the Eminent Conference in November. And I'm really, really happy and excited that he accepted my invitation. So the world is not flat, and Dr. William Rankin, who is a professional speaker and independent learning consultant with a really broad experience in educational technologies and pedagogical design, he's going to talk about that. And he is already working with schools, governments, learning organizations throughout the world to design, develop, and implement innovative learning initiatives. And I'm sure we have many things to learn from him, so I don't want to talk more. So I would like to give the floor to him and thank you once again, Bill, for accepting our invitation. I can't hear you for some reason. I don't know why.
I know why. I forgot to unmute
Okay.
my microphone. Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Irene. I really appreciate this effort, and I hope this is useful. If you have any questions or need anything, my contact information is at the bottom of each of the slides, and I'd be glad to chat with you. So, hello, everyone. I'm going to dive right into the presentation now, if that's all right. And let's see if we can get this going. All right, can everyone see all right? I hope so. Today I want to walk through sort of a strange journey, but I want to think about learning and the future of learning and some of the ways that we might make our learning environments richer and broader. And so to start, I want to think about the future of learning. We've talked about the future for, it turns out, hundreds of years, imagining what it might be like. And I want to start with a picture. This is a picture from the 1950s, a fellow called Arthur Radabaugh, and he made this vision of the future of learning. But the problem with this vision, I think, the problem with what Radabaugh creates is that he's inserting technology in. He thinks technology will be very important in the future from his vantage of the 1950s. But he's not changing anything else about the learning environment. So children are still sitting in rows, they're still working on the same thing at the same time in the same way. The teacher's still up at the front. They're not doing anything apparently meaningful. And in fact, the only really innovative thing in this picture is the child who has a personal helicopter. That's cool. But everything else in this picture it could be done just with paper. It doesn't change fundamentally. And part of the problem for this is that Radabaugh only understands the importance of content. But he doesn't understand the importance of two other critical dimensions of learning: the community of people with whom we work and the contexts in which our work is driven and in which it makes sense, in which we make things. So I'd like you to step back for a moment and think about your own learning experience. Something you've learned recently, or something that you've learned not for a course necessarily, but just because you wanted to learn about it. A hobby, perhaps, knitting or cooking or some kind of craft. And in those, we don't just think about content, we think about all three of these. Let me walk you through what I think is an important part of this process. So we experience this thing I call the stream of experience, all these things moving beyond us. But every once in a while, a thing or a person or a place will jump out at us. And it creates this gravitational pull of curiosity that leads us to want to know more, the beginning of the learning journey. We approach the content of learning with questions. How does that work? What is that? Why is that there? We want to know something about it. So the reason we want to start knitting might be that we see someone with a great jumper and we say, I'd like to have something like that. How does that work? So that question drives our desire to learn, the spark of curiosity from this stream of stuff that goes through our experience every day. That leads us to a challenge, though. If we don't get that, we fall out of the learning system. We just decide, well, it's not really for me. So if we don't have that spark of curiosity, we don't proceed to the next level. But if we do have that spark, then it takes us to the next thing, which is almost invariably some kind of connection. Hey, can you help me figure this out? We connect with another person directly or sometimes via media. And that undergirds our initial learning effort. We contact someone and say, can you help me with this? Can you help me figure this out? Can you give me a tool or a start or a challenge? And again, if we can't connect with someone else, we tend to just fall out of the learning moment. We say, well, I can't find anything more, so it's not really for me. But if we do find a person, it sparks us to move to the next thing, which is almost always a project, a practice. Let me try that. We use some basic tools and some basic skills and resources, and we give it a try. If we don't get access to those tools, if we don't get access to those resources, if we're not given some kind of project, it's really hard for the learning to become sticky. And again, we'll fall out of that process and it will disappear. But given that environment, that space where we can try it out, it leads us to the next thing, a moment of evaluation where we think about it. What was that like? We don't necessarily have to have enjoyed it. We might have just been challenged by it. Oh, that was really tough. And, but next time I think I would try this. And that sense of challenge, that sense of enjoyment, if we don't have that, again, we fall out of the learning moment. At every one of the first 4 phases, we can drop out. But if we're challenged by it, or if we enjoy it, if there's some kind of something there that triggers us to want to pursue it, we move to something that actually recapitulates the first step. We start internalizing this. We ask bigger questions. We want to know on a deeper level how this new skill or this new topic we're learning works. So we begin to expand our skills and abilities. We begin to expand our scope of interest. And that sparks a deeper interest in understanding this that begins to affect our identity. We start to say, well, I am this kind of person. I do this kind of thing. That leads us to a new, larger group of collaborators, people with whom we share, fellow learners, experts. We start to connect in a bigger way with other people. And interestingly, we also start to connect with new learners. We become the spark, that connection that a new learner needs to start into the discipline that we're increasingly becoming good at. As we connect with those other people, we try bigger and bigger projects that allow us to develop and master the topic about which we're learning. Cooking or calligraphy or dance or some kind of skill. And the projects that we make in that mastery become, again, a spark that brings in new learners. They see that and they say, wow, how do you do that? Or what is that like? Or how could I approach that myself? So we begin to recapitulate this learning process. Again, we come to a moment of evaluation. We extend our understandings and ongoing, and we increasingly develop an identity as a practitioner or as an expert in this topic. And that cycle repeats and repeats. And overall, it looks like this, a big structure. If in the first phase, the initial phase, the encountering phase, we don't have any one of those 4 things, we drop out. and we say, well, this isn't really for me. We return that stuff to that kind of cloud of stuff. But if we get those and repeat to the second series, which looks very much like the first, then we start looping back and forth, increasing our capabilities, increasing our expertise. And if you look at what all of these things are, they recapitulate those things that we saw that were lacking in Radabaugh's vision. He had content, but he didn't have a meaningful community of people. The students were working in isolation, and he didn't have a meaningful context. And there was no place really for learner reflection. Here's what I mean by these three things. By content, I'm thinking about facts and data, structures and concepts, the tools we use in developing whatever it is we're learning, and the skills we need to operate those tools. For community, we of course think about mentors, but also the co-learners with whom we're learning, the sources and resources that we consult with to help undergird our learning, and an audience of people to whom we demonstrate our learning, people outside who see the products of what we're making. And finally, by context, we think not only about the learning spaces, the practice spaces where we try things out, but also the spaces where we make things. In addition to those two spaces, though, we have to think about place. That if I'm in Ukraine, it's a different experience than if I'm in France, and I have to think about the cultural and social and historical meaning of a particular place at a particular time, but also the broader environment, the social, historical, cultural milieu, the space in which I exist. All of these are a context that informs what it is that I make and how I make it and how I make my meaning meaningful, my learning meaningful. These are not separate elements, but they're actually parts of a single structure, a kind of three-dimensional cubic structure. Content, community, and context are connected together, and they cannot be separated because they each exert influence over the other. They're facets of a single kind of jewel or crystal. So the other issue, of course, is that that jewel or crystal isn't static. It doesn't stay in a single phase, but it has to grow. As my own learning grows, as my own capabilities grow, and I have to get bigger contexts and more kinds of people, bigger communities, and more challenging kinds of content. So the problem with Radabaugh's vision is that he doesn't really think broadly about what new technologies can allow us to do, the ways that those technologies can help us engage with content, but also with community and context. He really only thinks about the old-fashioned ways that we had to do things when our classrooms were cut off from the rest of the world. And the challenge of this is understanding the future. It's really hard. So I often do this exercise where I have people complete this sequence of numbers. And you might take a moment to just consider what comes next. Now, what most people will say is, well, it's really obvious. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. It's completely logical and completely clear. Everything adds by twos. But it's not the only answer. For example, if we add 2 and 4, we get 6. If we add 4 and 6, we get 10. 6 and 10 is 16. 10 and 16 is 26. But that's not the only way to do it either. If we add all of them, so 2 plus 4 is 6, 2 plus 4 plus 6 is 12, 2 plus 4 plus 6 plus 12 is 24. I was talking with someone once, and he said, well, what if 6 is just as high as it goes, and then everything else is, downhill from there? All of these are possibilities, and all of them are based on logic. So if we graph these, if we say, okay, here's what these are going to look like, we get the blue line, the green line, the yellow line, the red line. So the question that I often ask people is, the majority of people will give us that blue line, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And the reason is that for most of human history, that additive model was all we really needed. Well, things changed very slowly. So for most of human history, there was not a significant change between not only my generation and my parents' generation, but my generation and my great-great-great-grandparents' generation. Things looked pretty much the same. But now we're really following that yellow line. If you think about how much your life looks different than the lives your parents were unable to live or your grandparents, it's crazy how fast technology is changing the world. For example, I'm sitting here in a chair in Virginia talking to you all over the world. It's unbelievable. If our students' experience is the yellow line, but we're still building our schools along that blue line, then school looks increasingly irrelevant. If we want to build a school for the future, we have to see the patterns behind the ones we've come to expect. We have to start thinking bigger and more dimensionally, and we have to start really imagining not just a future where technology changes how we do something, but where technology changes what we do and how we contextualize what we do. That's really important. So given that the future is hard to predict, but that we have to start looking behind things, where do we start? And I think part of what we should think about is not only how to build learning experiences, but just experiences in general. That's how we learn. So let's think about some of the ways we can build experiences. And let's think about how design ought to work in that. Design should always serve an audience. We should do things in our schools to connect people in a very particular way. It should support a purpose. We don't want to just make choices because. We want to have a purpose behind them, a relevance for why we're doing what we're doing. We have to take the understanding students and learners and teachers already have and supplement that so it's symmetrical, so it fits with things they know and experience in their lives. But we also have to get rid of extra stuff. We have to focus and converge the way we design things. We have to strengthen an experience and facilitate new kinds of learning, stimulate discovery, which is about engagement, and we have to solve problems, which is about impact. If we can do these 7 things in the design of our schools, then we create a learning environment that is rich and productive for all learners. So let's think a few things about what we know about learning. And I want to start, there's a book that the U.S. National Research Council came out with a number of years ago. It's got some great research in it. The first 3 chapters are really useful for teachers. You can get the link to this at unfoldlearning.net, which is our blog, and it's a free download. But one of their observations is that students come with preconceptions about how the world works. This is based on research that they've done. If their initial understanding is not engaged, they can fail to grasp the new concepts and information or learn them only for the purposes of a test, but revert to their preconceptions outside of the classroom. This parallels research by a fellow called Derek Muller. Muller was doing a doctorate at the University of Sydney a few years ago, and he was a physics PhD student, and he was studying physics education. And he wanted specifically to think about how Khan Academy videos would work for learning physics. And so he showed his students, he gave them a pretest, first of all, of their knowledge of physics concepts. And people scored about 6 out of 20 on that pretest. Then he showed them Khan Academy videos. And he asked them how they felt about those videos. Oh, they were really helpful, people said. They were really clear. They helped me learn a lot. They were really informative. They were really useful. I really liked them. Then he gave them a post-test after they watched those videos that explained physics concepts. And they scored 6.1 out of 20. No statistical change. And the reason for this, he said, has to do with what I just read about the National Research Council. Students have existing ideas about scientific phenomena. If the video presents scientific concepts in a clear, well-illustrated way, students believe they are learning, but they do not engage with the media on a deep enough level to realize that what was presented differs from their prior knowledge. It made no difference. They watched the video, they consumed the content, but it didn't change who they were. And in fact, he said they went through a series of 5 moves. First of all, he said, they thought they knew the concepts anyway. Because of that, and this was a quote from one of the respondents, they didn't pay utmost attention to the video. Because they didn't pay utmost attention, they didn't recognize that what was presented was different from what they were already thinking. Because of that, they didn't learn a thing, and this is the sort of ribbon on top. They got more confident in the incorrect ideas they thought before. So what Muller did was he created a series of videos that started out like the Khan Academy videos, but in the middle, they collided people with their misunderstandings, forced them into a challenge. So they were going along fine, and then all of a sudden, they faced this really complicated challenge that they didn't know how to solve in the video, a problem that they didn't understand. He asked people how they felt about these videos. Oh, we didn't like them. They weren't useful. They were confusing. They were frustrating. It didn't help me learn anything. When he did the post-test for those learners, they scored 12 out of 20. In other words, if we're in the business of helping our students know, we have to realize that knowing about a thing is not really the same as knowing it. And that means learning about a thing is not the same as learning it. And that means learning about a thing is not really learning. Fundamentally, what we have to do with content, our goal with content in the current informational world, has to be to present our learners with challenges. Challenges where they have to recontextualize the content, where they have to apply it in new ways, where they have to not just repeat it, but use it. Challenges solidify content and transform information into knowledge. Let's imagine another scenario. Let's imagine that we're in a cooking class. And hello, welcome to Cooking 101. I'm Bill Rankin. I'm your teacher, and I think we're going to have a great time this term. To begin with week 1, we're going to start a unit on spoons. Spoons are very useful for cooking, and you can use them for stirring and tasting. I want to start with something approachable, so we have a week's unit on the spoons. I hope that'll be a good way for us to start. At week 4, we'll start a unit on knives. Now, having good knife skills, when you start cooking, it's going to be very important for you to know how to use a knife properly, and and I don't want you to cut yourself, so I want us to have our spoon skills really down, and then we'll start with knives. When you start cooking, it's going to be very important for you to know how to use knives well. At week 8, we'll start a unit on pots and pans. Now, there's a lot of information here. You need to know which pot to use and which pan to use when we're cooking. When you start cooking, you're going to have to understand all of these complexities. This is a very large unit. There will be an exam at week 8, so I want you to be ready for that. Again, as we start cooking, later on, then this is going to be very important information. At week 14, we'll start a unit on stoves. Now, stoves are dangerous. You can burn yourself or cause an explosion, so I want to have all of our skills in place. Once you start cooking, of course, it's going to be very important for you to learn how to use stoves, so that'll be a critical piece for us to learn as we learn in Cooking 101. Well, we don't have time to actually cook this year, but next year, actually, no, not next year. After graduation, when you start cooking, all of this information will be really useful. Is this how we learn the tools of cooking? Is this how we learn to cook? By studying each individual aspect on its own? No, of course not. We learn to cook by cooking. We put all those pieces together. We make things, and we make messes, and we do all this stuff. That's how we have to do with our learners, not try to march them one by one through each of the skills and tell them someday, eventually, this will be useful to you. We need to always cook from day one. That's really important. Cook from day one. Information on its own is not enough. And activities, while they're more powerful than information, are still not enough. Making with the information we have. That's where we really learn and solidify that information. That's the piece we know from our own kind of learning when we're learning to apply things that we're learning as a hobby. It's how we have to do in school as well. Making sets the context for learning and transforms information into an experience. One last thing. I don't know if you've run across this book called The End of Average by a fellow called Todd Rose. Rose barely graduated high school. He graduated in the US. We have a 4-point scale. He graduated with a 0.9. So as you would imagine, he now runs a Brain and Learning Institute at Harvard. But he had to find his own path through school. He had to figure some things out. And he writes this great book. It's a really fun book about the history of standardized testing and a lot of the ways that we make school to this day. And what he says is this. He tells a story. He's got a great TED Talk, which you could go watch. I'm going to give it to you really quickly. So in the late 1940s and early 1950s, the U.S. Air Force starts having a lot of crashes, and they're trying to figure out why. Why are these planes crashing? Initially, they think, well, it must be the planes, but they do forensics on the wreckage. It doesn't seem to be mechanical problems. It must be pilot error. So they go and they look at the way pilots are being trained, but they can't figure it out. It doesn't seem to be anything with pilot training either. There's a young researcher in the Air Force, and he says, I know what the problem is. It's the cockpits. And the Air Force says, this is not possible. In 1923, they had taken the measurements, 16 core measurements of thousands of pilots, their height, the width of their shoulders, their peripheral vision, their reach, all of these kinds of dimensions. They had taken all of them from thousands of pilots, averaged those together, and then they had set that as a specification. All cockpits had to be measured, had to be created to that measurement so that it would fit the majority of people. There's no way the problem was with the cockpits. But what this researcher started doing is he started looking at the complex system that all of those measurements were. So it turned out that there were indeed, this was right after the Second World War, there were thousands of pilots who were average height. But if you said average height and average shoulder width, that number didn't stay the same. It got suddenly smaller. There were many fewer people who were average in both of those dimensions. And if you added average height, average shoulder width, and average reach, it was fewer still. And by the time you got to just 4 of the 16 criteria, there was not a single pilot in the entire Air Force who was average. The Air Force was literally building cockpits for no one. So this researcher said, we've got to make it so that each cockpit fits each pilot. And the Air Force said, well, that's impossible. It would be too expensive. But then they said, well, I guess we could make it so the seats could go forward and backwards and up and down. And I guess we could make it so that you could rearrange the instrument panels a little bit. And I guess it's all the stuff we have in cars right now. And when they started building a cockpit that shaped itself around the pilot, the crashes stopped. Here's what Rose says. Individuality matters. The individual is not an error, and on human qualities, individuals cannot be reduced to a single score. I usually show this, weirdly enough, with M&Ms, with the chocolate candy that comes in these 6 different colors. And so I give out packs of M&Ms to people, and I have them count. I have them do an M&M census and count the number of colors in their bags. And although I could not give you M&Ms today, I apologize for that. Here are the results of one of those censuses. And so one of the interesting things is if you look overall, even the total number of M&Ms in these little bags is not the same. Some people, one person has 19, someone else only has 13. They start with this deficit. But if we look at the averages, so we'll round, it's 2 brown ones and 2 red ones and 5 orange ones, and we'll call that 2 yellow ones. Initially, there are 4 people who are average on the number of brown M&Ms. Person A, person B, person D, and person I. But if we look at browns and reds, 2 and 2, person A falls out, person B is still in the running, and D is still in the running. I falls out. Now, 2, 2, 5, nobody. Nobody is average. If we're building our schools for the average student, we're building for no one. And if instead of M&Ms, we imagine those being different kinds of literacies, what does it mean if we've built for an average literacy, average textual and numerical, rhetorical, emotional, audiovisual, or collaborational literacies? What it means is we're building a school for no one. Now, usually we don't even deal with those last three. We really focus on these first three, and we've been focusing on those since the Middle Ages. This is the trivium and quadrivium of the Middle Ages. But when we talk about 21st century skills, we're often talking about those last three too. Can people empathize with people who are different from them and from different places? Emotional literacy. Can they tell a really compelling story in images and in sounds for people who might speak a different language or come from a different background? Can they work productively together? Can they have collaborational literacy? These are the things we have to build. And we have to recognize that our students, our learners, are in all kinds of different, they have different configurations. Now, the way we get to those averages in the first place is by blending all of our results together. And if you think about what Lev Vygotsky was talking about back in the teens and 20s, Vygotsky developed this idea of the zones of proximal development, that we can learn if we collaborate and share our skills with someone else. So if I've got a lot of emotional literacy and you've got a lot of audiovisual literacy, if we work together, we actually both expand. We expand the thing we don't have. That's what Vygotsky said. So if we can build a space where our learners can bring their individual constellations of gifts and abilities together, instead of trying to make a standardized space for them, then we provide a space where everyone can grow and everyone can increase in capability, even in the spaces they don't have, or in the literacies they don't have. Some students, maybe one literacy is really big and maybe they're not terribly interconnected with each other. Someone else will have a completely different constellation of literacies. And so we have to build the classrooms that allow each of those students to fit, not a standardized cockpit, but a place where they can conform projects to themselves. Now, what Rose says is we have to remember three things. First of all, and over everything, we have to remember that humans are dynamic systems. We're not monolithic entities. We're interrelated systems of things. Because of that, he says, we have to keep data jagged. The average IQ is around 100. You could be at 100 IQ because you have really good spatial reasoning. I could be at 100 IQ because I have really good verbal reasoning. If you treat us the same because we have the same number, you're dooming one of us to not succeed. So keep the data lumpy. Don't smooth it out. Don't say, okay, this is for the hundreds and this is for the 90s. You have to leave us in our own unique mix. Keep the data jagged. The second thing he says is that we behave more by context than by trait. Some people are very shy, but they're not shy in every context. They're shy with strangers, but not their family. Other people are shy with their family, but not with strangers. The context determines how we behave. We are not always shy. We're shy in some situations, but not others. So if a student isn't doing well, then change the context and you create new capabilities for them to perform. The final thing he says we have to remember is that people have to take multiple paths to get where they're going. He himself was terrible at school and he had to find his own path. As teachers, one of the ways we create this diverse capability is not by setting the path, but by setting the destination, the goal, and letting every student find whatever path that student needs to find to get to that goal. Some people will get there very quickly and will take shortcuts. Other people will have to go the long way around. But all of them will find a way there. And if they can work with each other, they will bring others along with them. If we set the path, then we wall off the possibility of innovation and new discovery, because students might find a way that we never imagined to get to the goal. So collaborating, working together, builds a community, and in communities, our resources become the resources that our fellows can tap into. Community transforms information and capability and skill into a resource. So with content, we want to challenge. With community, we want to build and work together. With context, we want to make. That's the way to engage these multiple dimensions. And again, each of those has to grow as our learning grows. Let's think about a couple of quick structures of learning, and then I want to talk a little bit more about the cube, and then I'm done and we can chat together. I don't know if you know the work of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He was working in the 1980s especially, and he looked at artists. And all artists got into this thing he called the flow channel, this space. Maybe you've had this happen. You're working along at something, and all of a sudden you look out the window and think, huh, when did it get dark out? I forgot to eat lunch. That state where you kind of lose track of time and lose track of anything, he called flow. And all of the artists he was looking at, they found that way into that flow state. And he discovered in his research that flow was a function of challenge versus skill. If challenge was too high and skill was low, then people were anxious and terrified. If challenge was too low and skill was high, they were bored. But when these were pushing each other right at the edge, that's when people entered flow. They don't move linearly through the flow channel. They move in this kind of winding direction. So when you're first learning a thing, you're a little bit scared and nervous. But as you get more confident with it, well, it starts to get maybe a little boring, which is the time for a new challenge, which moves you up towards anxiety. And then as you get comfortable with that, you move a little bit towards boredom, which is time for a new challenge, etc. That's one of the tools we can use for helping our learners discover. Let's thinking about how their engagement works and how they're in that flow channel. There's a fellow called Punya Mishra and his team. Some of you may be familiar with what was called the TPAC model. He and his team developed that. They were trying to think about 21st century learning and what 21st century learning looks like. And so they decided to put together the top 15 21st century learning paradigms and see what they had in common. So this was Howard Gardner's 5 Minds for the Future, and Henry Jenkins talking about participatory culture. This was the EU Parliament. This was Daniel Pink's A Whole New Mind. What were all of these things? What did they have in common? And they decided that there were 3 things: foundational knowledge to know, humanistic knowledge to value, and meta-knowledge to act. So foundational knowledge, this included core content, my ability to talk across disciplines, and my understanding of digital literacy and ICT. This was the sort of old stuff. The new things that were in the 21st century were humanistic knowledge, understanding cultural competence, ethical and emotional awareness, life and job skills, and meta-knowledge, communication and collaboration, problem-solving, critical thinking, creativity, and innovation. All of those together made up the common backbone of what all of those authors were talking about when they were talking about 21st century skills. I think that Mishra's 3 things and my 3 things are related, because I think that my experience of content, for example, that affects my foundational knowledge. If I only have a small experience of content, then I only have a small foundational knowledge. My experience of community, understanding how people value a thing, if I have a small experience of community, I have a small humanistic knowledge. If I have a bigger experience of community, I have a bigger experience of humanistic knowledge. And context helps me understand meta-knowledge. How do I act and create? Again, with each of these, I have a task. There's something I have to do. So with community, I have to collaborate. With content, I have to challenge. With context, that's the space where I create. And I think that there are 4 different kinds of levels on each of these facets. So at its most basic, content is delivered to me. The teacher tells me what to do. It's Radabaugh's vision. Here's the assignment. You follow it. The teacher tells you what to do and delivers content to you. But you have no inherent responsibility towards that content. You don't have to make any decisions about it. You just have to eat it and repeat it. A slightly bigger experience of content comes when a teacher directs me to content. So I put a bunch of stuff out online. Go find the thing that works for you. Now, I'm not having to use the tools of discovery myself yet, but I am starting to have to make decisions about that content. What's meaningful? What's important? What fits my task? Even though the teacher is directing me to it, I'm starting to have to take some responsibility for deciding which content to use. At the next level is discovered content. Now, no one is necessarily just giving me all the content. I'm having to go out and find some on my own. That means I have to have research skills. I have to understand what's valuable, what's real, what's not real. I think that's a critical skill that unfortunately in my country these days people don't really have, understanding what's real and what's not real. At the deepest level is creation, where I'm adding new content. Each of these dimensions encompasses the dimensions below. So when I'm creating, I might have some content delivered to me, and I might have some directed. I might discover some on my own, but I'm making new things. This doesn't mean that I have to have a PhD. For example, a first-year student who creates a video helping other first-year students learn phonetics for reading is creating, is making something. They have to think about what their fellow students need and how their fellow students will be engaged. That's pretty complex, even even a first-year student can do that complex work. So at each of these levels, we can have different kinds of dimensionality. If we think about community, most of our schools work in isolation. This is the Radabaugh vision, right? Every student is sitting alone and working without chatting with the other students. It's weird because in most schools we require people to work largely in isolation, and yet we never imagine working in isolation ourselves. If I had to make something for my job and I don't show it to anyone and I don't consult anyone, that's a recipe for getting fired. At the next level beyond isolation is connection. For example, a student might consult with someone who is an expert and might read a book that helps explain a concept or a situation. They're connecting with someone else. But that other person doesn't have any responsibility or interaction with the project the student's making. The student can quote them, but that other person, I don't really have to have interpersonal skills to use that person's information. At the next level, though, I do. I'm starting to cooperate with other people. And now we have to start negotiating. We might, you might want to move one direction, I might want to move another direction. We're going to have to compromise on that. So as we cooperate together, we're also having to have more social skills. At the deepest level, what I call consolidation, we are so interconnected that you can no longer extricate us one from the other. We're so committed to the project and so committed to one another that we're working broadly together now in ways that we can't be separated any longer without damaging the project. In terms of context, most of our classrooms are generic. A learning space, a classroom is a classroom pretty much no matter where you go in the world. The space is just a space. There's nothing in that space that drives a reason for learning. So in Radabaugh's example, they're just in this room. I don't know why they're learning algebra in that room. They're not using it for anything except to solve problems. It's generic. At the next level, at the next deepest level, is artificial context. A teacher might say, we're going to look at this case study, and there are rules in the world of this case study. This company or this group has to make certain decisions. This tribe has certain values, and you'll have to understand those if you're going to think about what they would do next. So an artificial context is one in which there are some rules, but if I make a bad choice, I don't die, right? So I'm not really deeply engaged because, the context is artificial. It's made up. A teacher who has students go out and begin to do things in the real world and who controls for some of the variables there. So I'm going to have my students go out and They're going to use their chemistry experience, for example, to study pollution in our river. And they're going to work with maybe an agency in town to produce a report that will go to our city council. The teacher is now controlling the situation. It's a real world experience, but the teacher has made sure that there is no way for the students to get into real trouble. They've made some of the connections and relationships. They're controlling it, but still giving students a reason, an experience of the real world. At the final level, a genuine context. I'm just out there. I'm out in the real world, and if I make a bad mistake, I have to suffer those consequences. At each of these dimensional levels, there's more responsibility on us. We need more agency to act. And if I'm working to create knowledge, to create content in a consolidated community in a genuine context, I have to be exercising very robust and very mature levels of understanding about my topic, whatever it is. Now, you may know the SAMR structure, thinking about substitution, augmentation, modification, redefinition. Technology is the thing that allows me to move deeper into all of these levels. So let's look at what that looks like a little bit. So for example, in delivery, a teacher might give me digital documents. Great, I can do digital search and I can find things, but it's no different than paper. At Directed, a teacher might have some digital repositories and portfolios and say, here's a bunch of stuff. You can go out onto our portal and find it. You can use the library's search tools. Now I'm starting to get to collections that the teacher has made for me. I can do search. At Discovery, I'm going to start needing access and exploration tools. I'm going to need to understand how to do research. At Creation, open-ended creation tools, technologies are going to allow me to make whatever it is I need to make, a video or an image or anything like that. In Isolation, I only need single author tools. But to connect with other people, I might need a tool like the one we're using right now, Adobe Connect. So I can have virtual presence and social tools. I can start talking with people from far away and can start making connections. To cooperate, we're going to start having to have co-authoring and cooperative tools, and to be consolidated, we're going to have tools that allow us to be doing all kinds of things in tight connection with one another, so that we're doing these multi-channel things where we've got maybe a diary that helps us understand how we're working together, and we've got tools that we're co-authoring in, and all these other things. Generic stuff, well, I can use a spreadsheet and a word processor and general use tools. To be in an artificial context, I might do simulation, or I might do virtual reality tools. To be in a controlled experience, an experience of the real world, a mobile device, for example, is really useful for getting me out into the real world. And then for a genuine context, to be out in a place where I can make things and put them out for other people to look at and encounter and engage, production and dissemination tools. So all of those things, I think, begin to work together. If we assign a score, just put a number on each of these bricks, then we can start thinking about the sizes of the space. For example, a traditional classroom experience with content at 1 and community at 1 and context at 1, it's an engagement and learning multiplier. That's what we call this. The space is a 1 by 1 by 1 space. It's not that engaging. This is a traditional classroom space, a lecture space, for example. But if I start having students discover content and they're working in connection with other people and they're in an artificial context, the space is bigger. The expectations of them are bigger. They have to do more. They have to have more mastery. This is a bigger learning space, and that means there are more capabilities for engaging learners. If I'm having people create in a challenge-based course, for example, they're creating content, they're working cooperatively with one another, and they're in a genuine context, really solving problems, that's a bigger space yet. Ideally, we want to use all of these spaces. And if we think about the ways that we have our students engage at all 3 of these dimensions, then what we get is interesting. As those spaces become bigger, there's much more requirement for our students to show agency and mastery, to show that their learning is not just something they've regurgitated on a test, but something they can really apply. But the size of the spaces get bigger and bigger. And if we graph those spaces, then what we get is that yellow line we saw in the beginning. What we need for our students, what we need for our learners, is not to engage on a single dimension of content, not Radabau's vision, but on a broad vision, on a multidimensional vision where they can not only engage with content, but engage with other kinds of people, and engage in meaningful contexts so that they're using what they're learning to make a real difference in their worlds. And if that's true for our students, it's also true for our teachers, because learning is just learning. And that's all I have to say about that. So let me come back now to the screen. All right.
I have to say,
that was
William,
fast.
that everybody was really attending
But
in
I'm happy to entertain
really,
any
they were
questions
very
or
fascinated, and
to
there's a
think
lot of
about
discussion
what you'd
going
like
on
to
during
ask.
your talk about collaboration and what we also do in twinning, and how the ministers of education should also help in that direction that you're describing, and it's not only teachers. And so I don't know, I think I saw one question just because they're writing too much. So it's like, how can we measure the effectiveness of our working in the classroom? It's a question.
Yeah, and I do think, by the way, before I address that, that the e-twinning idea is really the heart of this cube, right? Here you are, people from all over the world. I mean, look at the number of countries we have participating here, but thinking together, working together, trying to build things together, and build things in the real context of your schools. I think that's very important. I think the way for us to measure what we do in our classrooms and the way for us to know that we're doing something effectively has to do not with what our students can do within that classroom, ironically, but what they can do outside of it, or how they can apply their learning outside. So one of the things that we're working on with a number of schools is thinking about the ways for learners in open-ended projects to be solving problems in their everyday lives. So how can they use the content in my course, whether that's, basic mathematics, or whether that's, social studies, social sciences, or, hard sciences. Can they use that to solve a problem that is real in their everyday lives? Being in a genuine context tends to drive, it gives me a reason for applying my learning. So it's that cooking example. I'm not just learning a tool so that eventually it makes sense to me. I'm using that tool to really cook and make something and see if what I'm making works. So I think we can score the ability of our students to take stuff out of our class and apply it. That's how we have to understand our success in the classroom. And so one of the ways then that we can assess that is by actually engaging the community in which we live, the community of people that our
So
students
I
come
just see
from,
another
and
question. You
having
brought some
them
great ideas
help
and
participate
insights.
in
How do we
assessment.
use those
So my
insights to
students
make
create a
structural
project, let's
changes
put
in
it out there and
educational
see how the
design
community
on
responds
government
to it.
level?
Yeah, I think this is challenging because I think what most governments want is actually the thing that Todd Rose says doesn't work anymore, which is um, we tend to um, we tend to focus on things like PISA numbers, for example, and so it's much easier for a government to say, "Here's my PISA score," than to say, well, our students can do things in the real world. I think it's very difficult. I think part of what we have to do as educators is actually educate government officials. Some of us are government officials on this in this class, I know, but to help educate our fellow government officials about what learning really looks like. And one of the challenges, I think, in the U.S., and I'm thinking about our unfortunate current administration, is that people have gone through school and they've scored on tests, but they don't know how to apply it to real life, and so they're not making wise choices. Um, the numbers can be meaningless if people can't apply what they're learning, and so if we can help people think of meaningful ways to assess. Um, One of the things I think about, for example, is in every country there are problems that are very complicated to solve. Um, and if we can have our students solving those problems or working to solve those problems, we're not just burning off their energies creating heat without light. There's an organization in Mexico called Educaruno, Educate One, and they started a program of having students solve problems with 4 words. So the first is feel. What do you feel is a problem? Second is imagine. How do you imagine solving that problem? Third is do. Okay, go do that. And fourth is share. And they put all of those student projects, they're in thousands of schools now, just with that very basic structure. They're in thousands of schools, and they've got their students solving problems. The share piece means that every time a student does a project, they have to put evidence of that project up online. And this can then be assessed by governmental agencies and by, in this case, they use business interests as well. The guy who founded this, Alfonso Romo is his name. He said, my country is threatened with all kinds of problems. And if we can have the students helping to solve those problems, then it helps the whole country. And so one way I think for us to do that would be to start thinking about assessments not based on
Yeah, I don't know
information,
if there are
but
any
assessments based on
questions.
performance in
More
the
questions
community
there.
and performance in context.
But I think we have a lot of things to reflect there. And, it was really inspiring, very interesting, very interactive, Bill. So if we should invite the community to judge the quality, so it's just like if we should invite the community to judge the quality of our teaching, what about the secondary programs in general? Should we wait? Because
Thank you very
should
much.
we
Thanks for this great opportunity.
change them? Yeah.
Oh, I see it here. Yeah. Should we change them? I I think so. I think, invariably we do more and more abstraction as we move from primary to tertiary learning. In tertiary, we begin to apply a bit more, perhaps at the end. But I think we actually need to be applying much more at the secondary level. So, um, having the learners in our classes outside of class, or thinking about the class as an atelier or as a workshop. So not as a place for me to consume content, but as a place for me to produce content that then goes out from the classroom. Um, so I think that a secondary curriculum that's focused on making, on creating, on building, actually helps the learners internalize the things that we're teaching them and gives them a sense of identity. I am this kind of person, not just I learned this stuff. Um, that's a much richer way to engage our learners and to make sure that they're not just putting something in their head that's going to fly out later, because it's turning it into a meaningful experience. How does this new concept of making work in U.S. Secondary schools now? It doesn't. The U.S. is really behind on a lot of this. I do think that some of the maker movement stuff is about this, but so much of even maker movement is just about creating. My wife calls it landfill content. She's a teacher, and at her school, So we make this junk, but we're not really using it. There's not a reason for it. I did see a private school that, for example, it was a school in New York, and the students at this school built out of plastic, something that could be printed on a 3D printer. They they built things to purify water in sub-Saharan Africa. They were these filters that fit into water pipes. Um, Having people solve real problems uh, gives them challenges that are meaningful.
And
And
the
so I
last
think
question,
if we
is there a
do
difference between
landfill
learning by
content,
doing and
then
learning
it
by
doesn't really
making?
help us. But if we're really solving problems, if we're really having people apply, then I think that's really powerful. I don't think so. There can be. It's kind of what I meant by I had that slide that said that information is not as great as activities, which is not as great as making. So if doing is meaningless, then it's actually not a very powerful way to learn. And making is the same. If making is meaningless, it's not a powerful way to learn. Um, there are some things in which we have to do because we can't necessarily make things with it. Um, so there are some fields that are disciplinary, for example. Um, but I think there's almost always a way to make. So if I'm a musician, I make by having a concert, for example. If I'm um, learning social sciences, I make by going into the community and understanding the people around me and helping to tell their stories. Um, and so I think if I think the danger of thinking about doing is doing can be disconnected from a meaningful context
Okay,
or a
and how to
meaningful
change current
community.
situation in
So
our
I
school system?
engage
On
in an
one side, we
activity
have system
that's
requirements,
doing,
and on the other side,
but I
teachers'
think that's not
autonomy
enough.
that
That's not
is
really what
on
I'm talking
only on paper, or it's
about. Yeah, part of it is I think as teachers. So what I'm suggesting is that teachers actually step out of the role of content. Um, it's not my job any longer to give my students content. They can find it. Uh, I can give them a bit of it, but it's not something that has to necessarily change a whole lot. It's not something that takes up most of my time. I do think that my time as a teacher has to be spent helping connect those governmental requirements, the requirements of the curriculum, the requirements of the Department of Education, whatever, um, to the activities that my students are doing. So I want my students solving problems. And my task is to figure out how their solution of those problems connects back to the learning goals. I think my two tasks involve helping my learners um, negotiate the world around them. So my job is to clear a path for them so that they can do what they need to do, and my job is to connect their path back to what the government wants to see or what the expectations are. And I know that people are asking about secondary about exams. My secondary students have to be able to pass these exams. Um, I guarantee you that if the students have used the content from your course in a meaningful way to solve a problem, they will not have a problem on the exams. And in large part because what we usually talk about when we talk about exams is I'm having my students memorize a lot of content that they can then spit back on the exams. But that kind of memory, it's called semantic memory, is not very powerful. And in fact, it takes years of spiking that kind of memory for us to remember things meaningfully. Whereas if you change that into other kinds of memory, the memory of narrative, for example, the memory of experience, there are different forms of memory associated with these, they're actually much stronger. And so students enter into an exam much more likely to remember the content that they need for that exam. And they're already used to applying it, so if they have to apply it in the exam, they're much more adept at that. So the idea of kind of drilling and memorizing that we usually do is actually a
That's
really
quite true.
weak
And I
and
have to say that, I
superficial
mean, in
way
e-twinning, the
of
teachers
helping people
use
engage
really a
with
lot of
content.
collaboration
If they've
among
used it in a
classes, among
meaningful
different
way, they're
countries,
going to remember it,
more
and it's going to
practical
stick with
things.
them much more.
And it looks like they are not learning, but they're really learning, and they're learning more in that way. So I think there are no more questions. So I would like to thank you. It was really interactive, as I said, very inspiring. And we have lots of
Absolutely.
things to think
Absolutely.
after that and try to implement them in our class. So thank you, Bill. Thanks everyone who attended this online seminar. And I wish you having a good night and a good afternoon for you, Bill.
Thanks very much. And if there's anything that I can do, I put my email
That's
address
great. Thank
in
you.
the feed there. If anybody wants to contact me or talk further